Okay, in this video we're going to go over the rest of the producer objectives. We're going to start with objective number 16. 16 says, I can identify a picture of ova and explain its role in the food web of a marsh. Here is a small picture of ova. We collected it, so you should know what it looks like from our trip. That's the resource from Wikipedia. I'll show you a bigger one. I just want you to know it's very thin. Its nickname is sea lettuce. That's important to know. It grows better when the water is warmer in the marsh, and it's eaten by a lot of scavengers, a lot of maybe small crabs, some herbivores, and then when you see it in other places, it's also eaten by sea turtles. What's unfortunate about ova is that it looks a lot like a plastic bag, and so a lot of animals are mistaking plastic bags for ova and eating them, which is causing toxic plastic ingestion. Alright, objective 17 says, I can define an nematocyte and explain how this is a structural advantage for producers living in tidal zones. And so that picture is a picture from your book. I like some pictures on the internet better than the ones that we collected, so I'm going to show you those. But before we get to pictures, I want to define the word nematocyte. Okay, it is an air-filled cell. So it's an air-filled cell that's found on their structure. So let's go to this website, Wikipedia, and I'm going to point out right here is a nematocyte, right here is a nematocyte, here's a couple, and it's filled with gas. Each species has a different gas that it's filled with, and the advantage, the second part of that objective is talking about the advantage. What is the structural advantage for this if you live in a tidal zone? And so the advantage, which I'm going to put as a positive sign here, is that during high tide, the algae can be upright. Okay, so during times of high tide, the algae can actually stand upright, which is important. So it can stand upright, which increases photosynthesis. We're going to go over the structure of algae. Algae does not have leaves, they have blades. They don't have roots, they have a holdfast. So there's different structures they have when compared to plants. But they do have chloroplasts just like plants do, and they do photosynthesize. And because light is limited, let me take you back to the website. Because light's limited, you can see that the water is darker here. This is an example of bladderwrack that's attached to a rock. We're going to learn that bladderwrack has to be on the bottom of a hard surface and to make sure that it attaches. And on the top, you can see that the air cells are what allow it to stand kind of upright. If it was not filled with air, it would lay flat and would receive even less light and possibly die because it's going, 12 hours underwater, 12 hours outside water total for the day. Alright, this is going to be our first organism in the plant kingdom. The other algae that we were talking about were in the protist kingdom, and so now we're entering the plant kingdom. Kind of something important to point out. The standard says I can define cordgrass and explain where cordgrasses thrive. And so cordgrasses, if you turn to page 16 in your book, you can see the definition there. But cordgrasses are really land plants that are salt tolerant. So that means they have mechanisms to be able to live in a salt environment. They have to get rid of the excess salt, or they have to be able to avoid diffusion of salt. So each plant has its different mechanisms of how it survives the salt environment, and each plant also has a different level of salt tolerance, which defines where it can be in a salt marsh. So for example, Spartina has a high tolerance. And that's where you're going to find it in the main parts of the marsh. But if you remember from our trip, we had Phragmites, which had a lower tolerance. I don't want to put low because it can survive some levels of salt. It's not like a maple tree or something that would not be able to survive that. Alright, turn to page 241 in your book and look at figure 1111. And you're going to answer this question: how does the level of sheltering from waves affect rockweed abundance? So we're just going to look at this diagram here. This is the figure 1111 on page 241. Here you have the exposed coast, and you have meters above low tide. So how many meters does it, survive on the ground? And then here you have a sheltered coasts, and how many meters? So I just want you to make your inference based off of this. We'll go over it in class, but I want you to look at this graph, or this figure, I'm sorry, and look at the exposed coast on shelter coast on how many meters it can stay above the shoreline. All right, 20. I can explain the role of Spartina, a type of cordgrass, on the stability of a salt marsh ecosystem. So we already talked about Spartina having a high tolerance for salt. When we collect it, obviously here you can see it's in a high tide. These are called emergent plants because they're not immersed in water. They're immersed in water. They're half out, half in. What I want you to look at over here are mussel beds that are forming at the bottom of Spartina. When I talk about the stability of the salt marsh, that's what I want to talk about. They're incredibly important, not only for the food web, but they're all over structure and their structural stability. So I'm going to the hyperlink that is found in the pre-post. So I'm actually going to this hyperlink right here. It brings me here. And so I highlighted some key points that I want to read with you. A salt marsh is born by the arrival or seed of the rafting of a plant of the cordgrass. And so basically what happens is it's going to start with seeds. We saw little pieces of Spartina that were starting to sprout out when we went on our trip. But what happens is when the Spartina grows, as you see here, just a little bit of Spartina, that traps sediment, fine particles, and it literally elevates the Spartina bed and rises it a little bit above seawater. Remember, cordgrasses are true land plants, so they have to have a little bit of elevation. And so right here it says causes a rise in the sediment surface and makes the habitat more terrestrial. As this happens, the grasses are able to invade, so they're able to grow in, and eventually they grow thicker and thicker and denser, and that's how Spartina forms. As we scroll down, I want to focus on the mussels. Now we're not in mussels yet, but I want you to look at these structures right here. These are called byssal threads. They're right here on this mussel. Mussels are different than clams and any other bivalves because they use those mussels, the byssal threads, to attach to hard things, and so they can attach to each other. But they really become the foundation, just like the foundation in your house. They become the foundation of a marsh, and so the intertidal marsh mussel is really, really important to the marsh. It becomes very densely packed. It enhances the growth of Spartina, and the reason why it does it is because it provides nutrients. Okay, when the mussels go to the bathroom, they release out nitrogen wastes, which are important. It's an important limited nutrient that the Spartina then needs. Okay, besides just providing them with actual nutrients from their fecal material, they provide them with that foundation we talked about and could stop or prevent erosion from occurring. And that's why salt marshes are so strong and able to absorb the wrath of storms and hurricanes. The fiddler crab also is important for the stability of the salt marsh because they aerate the soil. They aerate the sediment that the Spartina is growing in. All right, 21 and 22 are dealing with pickleweed, which is, again, we're in the plant kingdom. It's another type of cordgrass, but it's a halophyte. And so we're going to define the word halophyte as salt. Phyte means loving. If it was halophilic or phobic, that would be salt fearing. Phyte is philic, which is loving. And so they're extremely tolerant to salt. Explain how the pickleweed and other salt-tolerant plants can thrive in saltwater conditions. So we're going to go to this hyperlink, which is in the pre-post, and we're going to just kind of read through here. Pickleweed is a halophilic, salt-loving plant. We already just went over that. I'm going to scroll down. How does it survive living in such salty environments? Okay, it has a very high tolerance found within its cells. And here's how it does. It absorbs water through its roots, as all plants do, but it's also going to absorb that water with it, that salt with it. That's very toxic in high concentrations. So the salt is filtered out at the roots by tiny sodium-potassium pumps within the cell membrane. So it actively is going to pump that salt back out. It is one mechanism to pump the salt back out of the roots. Okay? Now, although these pumps filter out a lot of the salt, there's still going to be salt that gets through. So how do plants get rid of it? Some plants, which is written right here, do have glands that will excrete them out. Pickleweed does not. But what pickleweed has is special vesicles that actually store the salt. And you can actually see them when you look at pickleweed, these little protruding cells that are filled with salt. Okay, a vacuole can only hold a certain amount of salt. Once it holds too much, it actually is going to break. It's going to die. Younger cells take over the job. And so the first time I've ever seen pickleweed, they called it a salt succulent plant, and that's how I learned about pickleweed. And basically, it means that they have these huge cells that hold massive amounts of salt inside of them. And so if you ate them, they taste very salty like pickles, which is how they got their name. This paragraph is literally how I learned it in like 2003.